A new study on long COVID that looked at nearly 100,000 participants found that 1 in 20 people had not recovered, while 42% reported partial recovery 6 to 18 months post-infection. That study was conducted by professors from several Scottish universities. Joining me now is Dr. Linda Gang, the co-director of the Stanford Long COVID Clinic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So do we have a better idea now of who is most at risk of getting long COVID?
Yes, that's a great question. And I just want to say, too, that we're doing active research as a field. We're still learning a lot. It's a fast-moving field. And the hallmark of long COVID is its heterogeneity. Everybody's different, so it's hard to predict for any one person what's going to happen. But we have learned a lot through the studies and through clinical experience that certain factors such as gender and other medical conditions may be associated with the risk of long COVID, and that there's encouraging data to show vaccination may also help protect against long COVID. But none of these are guarantees. And certainly we have seen many individuals who may not have had these risk factors, but still be affected by long COVID.
So how do you define long COVID? What are the symptoms and how long do they last?
That is also an ongoing dynamic definition. Right now, long COVID is by health authority organizations defined as a time frame and persistence or development of new or worsening symptoms after COVID infection. That time frame, depending on what health agency you're looking at, the definition could be after 4 weeks, or more often it's being more defined as after 3 months. So somebody who has worsening or new persistent symptoms more than 3 months after their initial COVID infection.
Okay.
We've learned more about some of the most common symptoms of long COVID. That includes fatigue, cognitive issues, exercise intolerance, shortness of breath. But the list goes on, and there's a broad spectrum of experiences that people can have.
Sure. So new research shows that long COVID could also cause the body to age for some people. What does that mean? I mean, we think of aging, we think of, Benjamin Button or something like that. But tell us how that works on kind of a cellular level.
Yes, it's really interesting studies that are coming out that make observations that are revealing associated events after COVID-19 infection. And that's really what these are. They are looking in the electronic health record for events that are signs of what we, call, quote, as aging. For example, changes in your kidney function, changes in your organ function, and signs of that could point in that direction. They raise very important questions when they make these association observations. Two events, right? You got your COVID infection, and then another event happens thereafter. So now further research can build upon these to further understand the how and the why of these observed associations. And also, the other important question is long-term follow-up. Does this last for many years down the road? We still don't know that question as well, especially when we're, tackling big questions like aging. Is it temporary effects? Is it temporary associations, or is it long-term? And those are active questions that need to be addressed as well.
Sure. All right, I want to talk about Paxlovid. There are studies that say that taking Paxlovid could help reduce the risk of long COVID. How effective is it, and how does that exactly work? Because I've heard kind of contradictory studies on Paxlovid. Some say you take Paxlovid, the chances of you getting COVID or having the symptoms come back are higher. So what's your take on that?
Yes, this is an active area of research as well, and very interesting in terms of thinking about the different questions surrounding Paxlovid. There's a question that has been addressed in large studies, and hence the FDA, emergency use authorization for Paxlovid in the use of acute COVID treatment to prevent hospitalization and severe outcomes like hospitalization and severe disease and even death. That in those big studies, Paxlovid has been shown to be very effective in preventing those severe outcomes in acute COVID for those who are at high risk, right? So for those who have acute COVID, and if you're at high risk for severe disease, Paxlovid can be a really important medication and can be used safely in that context. And then there's another question, which is what some of the new studies that are coming out that are trying to address the question of, okay, so we talked about acute COVID and the risk of hospitalization and severe acute disease. But then what about long COVID? Does Paxlovid do anything to prevent long COVID or reduce the risk of long COVID? And there's a really interesting new preprint study, which still does need to go through the peer review process. And in this study, they also looked back on electronic health records and observed an association between the reduced rates of what they defined as long COVID and the use of this Paxlovid medication in a population that was part of the VA health system, which is a national health system for veterans. It really raises important questions about
Yeah.
the causal link, again, between Paxlovid use and the events that are defined as long COVID. So that's another thing, right? As I
Right.
mentioned, is the definition of long COVID is still fluid. So that presents challenges of interpretation, but it needs to be tested. So now it raises this important question. And the best way to test that question is well-designed clinical trials where people are actually randomly put into these treatments, either Paxlovid or placebo or some kind of control, and seeing what then you measure and compare of how you define long COVID events.
Okay. All right, Dr. Linda Gang from Stanford Healthcare, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.